You know what really humbled me as a woodworker? Standing inside Lincoln Cathedral in England, staring up at a carved oak canopy from the 1300s, and realizing I had absolutely no idea how they did it. I don't mean that in a vague, isn't that impressive kind of way. I mean, I literally could not figure out how a human being carved leaves that deep, that undercut, that three-dimensional into white oak, using hand tools. The leaves curled back on themselves. The stems disappeared behind other stems. There were faces, grotesques, creatures emerging from tangled vines, and every single cut was confident and precise. I spent the next 2 years tracking down the answer, and it came down to two tools that most of us have never picked up, and a way of using a mallet that I had completely wrong. Today I'm going to walk you through exactly what I learned about how medieval cathedral carvers achieved that work, and how you can start using the same tools and techniques in your own shop. Plus, stick around to the end because I'll show you a sharpening trick for curved gouges that changed everything for me. Let's get into it. The carved woodwork inside Gothic cathedrals represents some of the most ambitious hand carving ever done in the Western world. And what's remarkable is that the tools and methods behind it aren't lost. They're just forgotten by most of us. Once you understand what these carvers were actually doing and why they chose the tools they chose, you start to see carving as a completely different discipline than what most hobby woodworking teaches. So let me start with who these craftsmen were and what they were up against. The Great Age of Gothic cathedral building in England and France ran roughly from the late 1100s through the 1400s. We're talking about places like York Minster, Lincoln Cathedral, Westminster Abbey, Notre Dame de Paris, Chartres. These weren't just religious monuments, they were enormous construction. Projects that employed hundreds of specialized tradesmen, and among the most skilled were the wood carvers. These men worked in organized workshops, often for decades on a single building. They had formal apprenticeships that lasted 7 years, sometimes longer, and they were carving in English oak, which, if you've ever worked with it, you know is about as forgiving as a brick. English oak, Quercus robur, is dense, hard, and full of tannins that dull your edge fast. It has a specific gravity around 0.72, which puts it well above most North American hardwoods people carve with today. The medieval carvers didn't choose it because it was easy. They chose it because it lasted. Oak choir stalls and canopy work from the 1300s are still standing today, still sharp in their detail because that wood simply does not quit. But here's the key thing I learned. These carvers didn't approach wood the way most of us do. They didn't think in terms of surfaces, they thought in terms of depth. Every design decision, every tool selection, every mallet stroke was about going into the wood, creating shadow, creating dimension, creating the illusion that stone foliage was growing out of a wooden panel. And to do that, they needed tools that could reach into places a standard carving gouge simply cannot go. That brings us to the first tool, and the one that completely changed my understanding of relief carving: the spoon gouge. Now, most woodworkers own a set of carving gouges. You've probably got a few straight gouges, maybe a shallow sweep and a deeper sweep, and they work fine for gentle shaping and surface decoration. But try to carve a leaf that curls under itself. Try to hollow out behind a raised vine. Try to clean up the back wall of a deep relief cut, and a straight gouge runs into a problem immediately. The handle collides with the surface of the work before the cutting edge can reach where you need it. The spoon gouge solves this with an elegantly simple modification. The blade curves along its length, dipping down and then sweeping back up to the cutting edge like the bowl of a spoon. This means the cutting edge can reach down into a recessed area while the handle stays above the surface of the workpiece. When I first picked up a number 7 sweep spoon gouge about 3/4 of an inch wide and used it to clean out behind a raised acanthus leaf, I understood instantly why this tool existed. I could reach a full 1.5 inches below the surrounding surface and make controlled, clean cuts in a space where no straight tool could operate. The medieval carvers had spoon gouges in every sweep and width you can imagine, from tiny 3mm veiners for the finest detail work to broad, shallow spoons over 1 inch wide for roughing out deep backgrounds. If you're buying your first one, I'd start with a number 5 sweep, about 1/2 inch wide. That will let you do background cleanup and moderate undercutting, which covers most of what you'll need when you're learning. Now, the second tool is one that I think gets overlooked even more than the spoon gouge, and that's the V-tool, sometimes called a parting tool. This is a chisel with a blade shaped like the letter V, and it comes in different angles, typically 60 degrees, 90 degrees, or 45 degrees. The V-tool is what defines every single line in Gothic carving. Every stem, every vein in a leaf, every edge where one element separates from another, every strand of hair on a grotesque face. When you look at cathedral carvings and marvel at how crisp and precise the outlines are, you're looking at V-tool work. The genius of the V-tool is that it cuts 2 walls simultaneously, creating a channel with clean, angled sides that catches shadow beautifully. A 60-degree V-tool about 1/4 inch wide was the workhorse of Gothic carving workshops. It outlines the design, it separates overlapping elements, and it adds linear detail that makes flat areas come alive. One thing I learned the hard way is that a V tool is unforgiving if it's not perfectly sharpened. Both wings of the V have to be exactly even, and the point where they meet, called the keel, has to be clean with no little hook or burr. If the keel has even a tiny imperfection, it will tear a line right down the center of your cut and ruin the crispness that makes the tool worth using. I'll come back to sharpening at the end, because that's where my bonus tip comes in. By the way, if you are enjoying learning about these old-world methods, I put together something I think you will really appreciate. It is called The Lost Workshop, and it is a complete guide to hand tool woodworking the way medieval craftsmen actually did it. 156 pages, 17 chapters, 33 illustrations. Techniques like the ones we are covering today, and a whole lot more. You can grab your copy by scanning the QR code on screen, or just use the first link in the description. Alright, let us keep going. Now, before you even touch a gouged oak, you need to understand how to select and read the wood. The medieval carvers were meticulous about this. They didn't just grab any plank off the pile. Cathedral carving was almost always done in quarter-sawn oak. When you quarter-saw oak, the medullary rays run roughly perpendicular to the face of the board. And that does two important things. First, it makes the wood far more dimensionally stable, so your carvings don't crack and warp over the centuries. Second, and this is the part most modern carvers miss, quarter-sawn oak carves more predictably. The grain is more uniform across the face, which means your gouge meets consistent resistance no matter which direction you push. When I switched from flat-sawn to quarter-sawn white oak for my own carving practice, the difference was night and day. Fewer tear-outs, cleaner cross-grain cuts, and I could trust the wood to behave the same way on the left side of a leaf as on the right. The medieval carvers also preferred oak that had been air-dried for years, sometimes decades. Green oak was used for structural timber, but carving oak needed to be seasoned and stable. If you're sourcing oak for carving today, look for quarter-sawn boards that have been dried to about 8 to 10% moisture content. Kiln-dried is fine, but if you can find air-dried English or European oak, you'll notice it carves with a slightly different feel. A bit more life to it, a little more willing to let the edge in cleanly. Now let's talk about mallet technique, because this is where I was getting everything wrong. Most of us, when we pick up a mallet and a carving gouge, we do the same thing. We hold the gouge in one hand, the mallet in the other, and we whack. We hit the gouge hard, trying to drive it deep into the wood in one shot. And in hard oak, that's a recipe for disaster. You either split the wood, overshoot your line, or shatter the crisp edge you were trying to create. Medieval cathedral carvers used a round carver's mallet, not a square joiner's mallet. The round shape means you don't have to aim the face. Any angle of contact drives the gouge forward. But here's the critical part. They used rapid, light, controlled taps, not heavy blows. I'm talking about a striking rhythm of maybe 3 to 4 taps per second, each one moving the gouge forward just a tiny amount, maybe a 1/16 of an inch per strike. Your wrist does the work, not your arm. The mallet weighs about 12 to 16 ounces, much lighter than what most people grab off the shelf. When I slowed down and adopted this tapping rhythm, everything changed. I could feel the wood through the tool. I could sense when I was approaching a grain change. I could stop precisely where I needed to. The old carvers called this listening to the chisel, and it's not poetry. You literally hear the tone of the tap change when the gouge enters end grain versus face grain, or when you're approaching a knot. For deep relief work, they would make a series of stop cuts first, driving the V-tool straight down along the outline to a depth of about 3/8 of an inch. Then they'd come in from the side with a spoon gouge, removing waste in thin layers, always cutting toward the stop cut so the chip breaks free cleanly. You repeat this process, deepening the stop cuts and removing more waste until you've reached the full depth you need. In some cathedral carvings, that depth is 2 inches or more, which means they went through this cycle dozens of times for a single element. Once I understood the mallet technique and the tools, I was ready to try actual Gothic foliage. And this is where the medieval approach really separates from modern decorative carving. When most of us carve a leaf, we carve it as a flat shape with some surface detail. The medieval carvers carved leaves as fully three-dimensional objects. The leaf rises off the background, curls at the tip, overlaps other leaves, and has a stem that actually goes behind other elements and disappears. To achieve this, they started by roughing out the overall mass of the foliage cluster with large gouges, establishing the high points and the deep pockets. Then they defined individual leaves with the V-tool outlining each one. Next, they shaped each leaf with medium sweep gouges, creating the convex surface and rolling the edges. Finally, they went in with spoon gouges to undercut beneath the leaf tips, creating that shadow line that makes the leaf look like it's floating free of the background. The undercutting is the step most modern carvers skip, and it's the step that makes all the difference. When light hits an undercut leaf, the shadow beneath it creates an illusion of depth that's almost three-dimensional. Gargoyles and grotesque faces follow a different sequence, but use the same tools. The medieval carvers would start with a squared oak block, usually about 6 inches by 6 inches by 8 inches for a typical corbel figure. They'd draw the front profile and the side profile directly on the wood, then rough out the basic form with deep gouges and a mallet, working from all four sides toward the center. The face would emerge gradually, the brow ridge first, then the eye sockets, then the nose and cheekbones, then the mouth. The V-tool defined every crease, every wrinkle, every strand of hair. Spoon gouges hollowed the insides of open mouths and the recesses behind pointed ears. What surprised me most was how late in the process the details appeared. For the first several hours of work, the piece looks like a rough lump. The face only snaps into focus in the final stages, when the carver adds the fine detail work around the eyes and mouth. It requires tremendous patience and trust in the process. One last thing about these carvings that most people don't realize. The medieval carvers left their tool marks visible on purpose. They did not sand. The faceted surface left by a sharp gouge catches light differently than a sanded surface. Each tiny facet reflects light at a slightly different angle and from a distance. This gives the carving a luminous quality that sanding destroys. When you sand a carving, you round over every crisp edge and flatten every subtle ridge into a dull, uniform surface. The medieval carvers understood that a sharp tool leaves a better finish than any abrasive. This only works if your tools are razor sharp, which brings us back to the importance of sharpening. Let me share some patterns I've noticed over the years, things I used to do myself that these medieval carvers handled completely differently. The first pattern is reaching for sandpaper to fix a rough surface. Most of us sand because it's what we know, and it does smooth things out, but the cathedral carvers never sanded. They made a cleaner cut with a sharper tool. If the surface wasn't right, they sharpened the gouge and took another pass. The result was a surface that was not only smoother but more visually alive. The second pattern is using too few tools. I used to think I could carve anything with 3 or 4 gouges. The medieval workshops had dozens of specialized shapes, and each one existed because no other tool could make that specific cut. Once I expanded my set to include spoon gouges and V-tools and multiple sweeps, I stopped fighting the wood and started actually carving. The third pattern is striking too hard with the mallet. I did this for years. Heavy blows feel productive, but they remove control. The light, rapid tapping technique gives you 10 times more precision, and in hard oak, precision is everything. The fourth pattern is avoiding deep relief. Most of us keep our carvings shallow because going deep feels risky, but shallow carving has no shadow, and without shadow, there's no drama. The medieval carvers went deep because they understood that depth is what makes a carving read from 30 feet away in a dim cathedral. The good news is, once you see these patterns for what they are, you can start shifting your approach one project at a time. Now, for that bonus tip I promised at the beginning. This is about sharpening the inside curve of a spoon gouge, which is one of the most frustrating things in all of hand tool woodworking. You can't use a flat stone, you can't use a standard strop. What the old carvers used, and what still works better than anything else I've tried, is a shaped slipstone. You take a small, fine grit sharpening stone. Arkansas stones work beautifully for this. And you choose one with a rounded edge that roughly matches the inside curve of your gouge. Then you hold the gouge steady, edge up, and work the slipstone along the inside bevel with short, controlled strokes, maintaining a consistent angle of about 15 degrees. After 10 to 15 strokes, you flip the gouge over and take one light pass on the outside, flat on. Your bench stone to remove the burr. The edge you get from this is phenomenal. I tested it by pairing end grain on white oak, and the surface came out glossy. No tear out, no fuzz. Once I learned to sharpen my spoon gouges properly, they went from my most frustrating tools to my most useful ones. Before we wrap up, if today's video taught you something new, imagine having 100 techniques like this at your fingertips. That is exactly what the Lost Workshop is. It is my complete guide to medieval hand tool woodworking, all in one place with 17 chapters, 33 illustrations, and 156 pages of clear instructions. You can get your copy by scanning the QR code on screen or using the link in the description. Thanks for being here. Subscribe if you have not yet, and I will see you next time. Take care, and I'll see you in the shop.